Hello and welcome. I'm Claire. I live in Northern Ireland and I design stamps and stencils and other bits and bobs that are good for folks who like to make cards and other paper crafts. Today's video is about my Forest Paths layering stencil set, which is a set of 6 stencils. You can get the set from clairebrennandesign.com, but if you're already waiting on your package arriving in the post, or if you already have the stencils, hopefully this video will help you get the most out of your purchase. Thanks very much for popping in. The Forest Path stencil set comes with 6 very detailed stencils and a really handy guide on what order to use them in and what colours to use on what stencils. It's a good idea to store your stencils separately, separated by a sheet of paper to stop the really delicate, intricate parts getting entwined. In this project, I use ink pads, soft brushes, cardstock, masking tape, and of course the stencil set. I always begin this image with stencil number 4, and I pop that in place, hold it with some masking tape, and I colour in the sky part at this stage only. I leave the bottom parts for later. You can see how the little guide marks there can be coloured in with pencil so that you can refer to those when you place your next stencil. I use really cheap makeup brushes to apply my colours. I find they work so much better than sponges. I apply colour by rubbing the brush onto the ink pad and then rubbing it onto the image on the paper, and I use small circular movements. I'm constantly changing direction back and forward so that we get into all of those tiny little detailed spaces. Have a look at the image on the front of the packaging for inspiration. You can mix colours in one stencil layer, just like I do here for the sky, with a sort of apricot tone mixed in with the pale blue of the evening sky. When you've finished colouring the sky from stencil 4, it's time to move on to stencil number 1. All of the stencils operate in numerical order after this point. When you're lining up your next stencil, always be guided by the image that you've just created. The little guide marks in the top corners are really handy if you kind of lose your way a bit, but always be guided by the image that you're currently creating. I find the stencils behave terribly well for me. They sit nicely in place when I'm brushing on inks. The only time I think I could get into bother with them is when I'm trying to rinse them in the sink. If you find your stencil does become a little bent or out of place, pop it in between the sheets of a heavy book and let it sit for a while. This is stencil number 2 that I'm using now. I'm using a prototype here, so mine doesn't have a number, but yours will come with a number cut into the top corner. As you work your way through the stencils, you can make the colours a little stronger with each layer as you get closer to the foreground, which should be probably a little darker than the background areas. Don't be afraid to mix colours within a stencil layer. Sometimes less is more, but sometimes more colour is fun and adds more interest. You can decide. Use a smaller brush if you want to add in a little bit of extra detail within the stencil layers themselves. I spend time weeding out all of the little plastic pieces from the stencils before I send them out, but here you can see where I've managed to forget to do that for myself. But if you should find little bits stuck in a hole that hasn't quite popped out, just pop it out with a pokey tool. It should come away freely. And now after stencil 3, it's time for the bottom part of stencil 4 again. I wanted my forest path scene to be a sort of a late autumn sort of a scene, so I'm using burnt oranges and solid greens and strong blues. You could use lighter colours if you wanted it to be maybe a spring evening. And now it's time for stencil number 5. You can really see here how the colour starts to build up over the layers, so it's not really vitally important to make sure that each layer is completely coloured in. You can leave little gaps or spaces or lightnesses to create a bit of texture and movement in your finished image. The soft makeup brushes are really great for getting into the tiny details in some of these stencils. Sponges just would not give you the same result. stencil 6, I'm using the darkest tones. I'm using a really strong navy and a really dark brown to bring out the tree trunks and branches. I found the smaller brushes worked really well for stencil 6. There's an awful lot of detail there, and I was constantly going backwards and forwards, changing direction just to pick out all of the detail and make sure that it comes out in the final image. I've really speeded up the video so that you can see it all happening, but it's worth taking your time on all of the stencils, and especially stencil 6, and making sure that you get into all those little crevices. And the last area to be coloured is the trees on the right hand side, and I'm using a little bit of green, some brown and a little bit of blue just to add a little more interest. And the best bit is when you take the last stencil off and your image is complete. Now, when you wash your stencil, rinse it under the tap, dry it flat on a piece of kitchen roll, and then store them between sheets of paper to stop them tangling.